"She doesn't belong in this room," William Carter said, not loudly, but loud enough to slice through the soft jazz and the delicate clink of crystal glasses, the kind of sentence that didn't need volume to carry weight, because power has a way of echoing without effort. And in the center of that $2,000 a plate charity gala, under chandeliers that shimmered like frozen waterfalls, a woman stood quietly, hands moving in the air, her lips forming words no one seemed willing to understand. Her silence louder than the entire room combined. And yet to them, she was an inconvenience, a disruption in a space designed for control, for influence, for people who spoke in deals and numbers, not gestures and pauses. And William, a man who had built a billion-dollar empire before turning 40, didn't look at her as a person. Not really. He saw a problem, something that didn't fit the script of perfection he curated so carefully, something that slowed things down, and in his world, anything that slowed things down didn't belong, not at his table, not in his presence, not in his night. So he adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at the event coordinator with a subtle impatience, and said, "Can someone handle this?" As if she were a spilled drink or a flickering light, something to be fixed quickly and quietly. But no one moved, not the manager, not the guests, not the staff who had mastered the art of looking busy when discomfort walked into the room. And so the moment stretched, thin and fragile, like glass about to crack, until from the edge of the room, where invisibility was part of the uniform, Zariah Brooks paused mid-step, a tray balanced effortlessly in her hand, her eyes lifting just enough to take in the scene, not with shock, not with confusion, but with recognition, the kind that comes from having seen this before, from knowing exactly what it feels like to be present and yet unseen. And for a second, just 1 second, she hesitated, because stepping forward in a room like this wasn't part of the job description. It wasn't safe, it wasn't expected, but neither was silence when someone was being erased in real time. So she set the tray down gently, the softest sound in a room that suddenly felt too loud, and walked toward the woman no one could hear, her steps steady, her expression calm, until she stood in front of her and did something no one else even thought to try. She raised her hands, and without a single spoken word, she began to speak. And just like that, the room that had everything money could buy was about to learn the value of something it never knew it lacked. Zariah did not rush. And that was the first thing that unsettled the room. Because in a place where every second was scheduled, priced, and controlled, her calm felt almost rebellious, her hands lifting with a quiet confidence that did not ask for permission, her fingers beginning to move in a rhythm that was both precise and graceful, like a language shaped by patience rather than power. And the woman in front of her froze for a fraction of a second before her eyes widened, not in confusion, but in recognition. The kind that comes when someone finally speaks in a world that has been silent for too long. And just like that, the tension shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, like the moment before a storm changes direction, and those closest to them leaned in without realizing it. Their conversations fading into half-finished sentences, their attention pulled towards something they could not fully understand but could no longer ignore, because Zariah was not just signing. She was listening with her eyes, responding with intention, translating not just words but emotion, and the woman's face softened, her posture straightening, her hands moving in return now, faster, more expressive, as if a door long closed had finally been opened. And for the first time that night, she was not invisible, she was present, fully, undeniably present, and the energy of that connection rippled outward, reaching even the edges of the room where William stood, his expression no longer confident, no longer certain, his gaze fixed on something he could not control, something he had almost dismissed, and there was a flicker there, subtle but real, the kind of hesitation that powerful men rarely show, because what he was witnessing did not fit into any of his categories. There was no transaction, no leverage, no negotiation, just understanding, raw and immediate. And it unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because it revealed a gap, not in the room, but in himself. And as Zariah continued, her movement steady, her presence unwavering, the woman let out a small breath that no one heard but everyone felt, a release of something held too long. And in that quiet exchange, something shifted in the room's invisible hierarchy, the one that decided who mattered and who did not. Because suddenly, the most important conversation was not happening at the head table, not between investors or executives, but right there, between a waitress no one noticed and a guest no one understood. And for the first time that night, William Carter did not look away, because he could not, because something in that moment demanded to be seen, and whether he was ready or not, it was about to change the way he saw everything. The room did not return to normal, and that was the second thing that unsettled them, because moments like this were not supposed to last, they were supposed to pass, to dissolve back into polite laughter and curated conversations. But this one stayed, stretching just long enough for people to feel it in their chest. And as Zariah's hand slowed, then paused, the woman in front of her smiled in a way that did not ask for approval, a quiet, genuine smile that carried more presence than all the polished confidence in the room combined. And then she signed something back, slower this time, deliberate, her eyes holding Zariah's as if making sure every word landed exactly where it needed to. And Zariah nodded, a small, respectful gesture, before turning slightly, just enough for others to see. And for the first time that night, she gave voice to the silence, not with sound, but with meaning, translating calmly, clearly. She says thank you for seeing her when no one else did. And the words, simple as they were, moved through the room like a shift in gravity, pulling attention, pulling awareness, pulling something deeper that many had spent years learning how to ignore. And William felt it, more than he expected, more than he wanted to admit, because in that single sentence, there was no accusation, no anger, just truth. And truth, when it arrives without noise, has a way of cutting deeper than anything loud ever could. And he straightened slightly, his jaw tightening not from irritation, but from something unfamiliar, something closer to reflection, as if the version of himself he had carefully built was being quietly questioned without a single direct challenge. And across the room, a few guests exchanged glances, uncertain, as if unsure whether to return to their conversations or remain in this unexpected pause, because the rules had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. And Zariah did not step back into invisibility, not yet. She stayed just long enough to finish the exchange, her hands moving once more, softer now, almost like a closing note. And the woman responded with a small nod, her shoulders relaxing, in a way that suggested she was no longer alone in a room full of people. And that was the moment William noticed something else, something he had missed before, the way Zariah carried herself, not like someone trying to prove anything, not like someone seeking attention, but like someone who already understood her value and did not need permission to show it. And that realization lingered, heavier than any deal he had ever negotiated, because it forced a question he had never considered, not about her, but about himself, about what he had overlooked, what he had dismissed, and what it had cost him without him even realizing it. And as Zariah finally stepped back, returning to her place at the edge of the room, the space she had once occupied without being seen, it no longer felt the same, because now, whether anyone admitted it or not, the most powerful moment of the night had not come from the man who owned the room, but from the one who had quietly changed it. The music eventually resumed, but it sounded different now, softer somehow, as if even the band sensed that something unspoken had shifted in the room, and conversations picked back up in fragments, quieter than before, less certain, like people were trying to return to who they were just minutes ago, but could not quite find the same rhythm. And William Carter remained still for a moment longer than anyone expected, his glass untouched in his hand, his eyes following Zariah as she moved away, with the same quiet composure she had carried before, except now every step she took seemed to leave a trace, not on the floor, but in the minds of everyone who had just witnessed what they could not explain, and that unsettled him in a way no failed negotiation ever had, because there was nothing to counter, nothing to correct, no strategy to reclaim control, only a realization forming slowly, uncomfortably, that power had just shifted without his permission, and it did not ask for approval. It simply existed, and across the room, Margaret Hale sat with a calm presence that had replaced the earlier tension, her posture relaxed, her eyes no longer searching, but observing, as if she had always belonged there and the room had finally caught up to that truth. And a few guests approached her cautiously now, not with confidence, but with curiosity, their smiles careful, their gestures uncertain, trying to bridge a gap they had ignored moments before. But it was too late to pretend nothing had happened, because the moment had already exposed something deeper than etiquette. It had revealed awareness. And awareness does not disappear once it arrives. It lingers, it questions, it reshapes. And William felt it pressing against the edges of his thoughts, challenging the certainty he had worn like a tailored suit, perfectly fitted, never questioned, until now. And without realizing it, he took a step forward, then another, drawn not by obligation, but by something quieter, something closer to understanding. And when he finally reached them, he did not speak immediately, which in itself was unusual, because he was a man who always knew what to say, always knew how to lead a conversation. But this time, the words did not come as easily, not because he lacked them, but because for the first time, he questioned whether they were enough. And Zariah noticed him before he said anything, her gaze meeting his briefly, steady, not confrontational, not deferential, just present. And in that brief exchange, something passed between them, not a challenge, not an apology, but recognition, the kind that does not need explanation. And Margaret looked between them, her expression calm, her hands resting gently in her lap, as if she already understood what was unfolding without needing to hear it. And the air between the three of them held a quiet tension, not uncomfortable, but significant, like the pause before a sentence that could change everything. And for the first time that night, William Carter was not the one controlling the moment. He was standing inside it, uncertain, aware, and about to decide who he was going to be when he finally spoke. William Carter finally spoke, but not with the authority the room was used to hearing, not with the polished certainty that had built his empire. Instead, his voice came measured, almost careful, as if each word had to pass through a filter he had never needed before. I think I may have misjudged the situation. And even that simple sentence carried weight, not because of what it said, but because of what it admitted. And the people closest to him noticed immediately the slight shift in tone, the absence of command, the presence of something unfamiliar. And Zariah did not react the way many expected. She did not look surprised. She did not look validated. She simply listened, the same way she had listened before, fully, without interruption. And that in itself changed the balance of the moment, because now it was William who felt seen, not as a billionaire, not as a figure of authority, but as a man standing in a space he did not fully understand. And Margaret watched quietly, her expression steady, her eyes moving between them with a calm awareness that seemed to anchor the entire interaction. And for a second, William hesitated again, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition that this was not a conversation he could lead the way he usually did. So he shifted, slightly, turning his attention toward Margaret, his posture less rigid, his presence less imposing. And though he did not know how to sign, he slowed his speech, his words deliberate, respectful. I am glad you are here tonight. And Zariah translated, her hands moving with the same clarity and grace, bridging a gap that had existed only because no one else had chosen to cross it. And Margaret responded, her hands forming words that carried warmth, dignity, and something deeper, something earned through years of being overlooked and underestimated. And Zariah watched closely, then translated again. She says she has always been here. People just rarely take the time to see her. And the sentence landed with a quiet force that no one could ignore, not the guests nearby, not the staff who had paused their movement, and certainly not William, because in that moment, the realization was no longer abstract. It was personal, it was direct, and it left no room for distance. And he nodded slowly, not out of habit, but out of understanding, a subtle acknowledgement that something inside him had shifted, not completely, not instantly, but enough to recognize that the way he had viewed the world, the way he had measured presence and value, had been incomplete. And as the silence settled again, it felt different this time, not empty, not uncomfortable, but reflective, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Because moments like this do not end when the conversation stops. They echo, they linger, they reshape what follows. And William Carter, a man who had spent his life controlling outcomes, now stood in a moment he did not control. Yet for the first time, He was beginning to understand that perhaps control was never the point. The room did not erupt into applause, and that was what made the moment real, because true shifts in perspective rarely announce themselves with noise. They settle quietly, reshaping the way people see. And as William stood there, he became aware of something he had not noticed before: the subtle distance between presence and recognition, the way someone could stand in plain sight and still be overlooked. And it was not just about Margaret anymore. It was about patterns, about habits, about the silent assumptions that had guided his decisions for years without ever being questioned. And he glanced briefly around the room, at the polished faces, the confident postures, the familiar rhythm of influence and status, and for the first time, it all felt slightly incomplete, as if something essential had always been missing but never acknowledged. And his gaze returned to Zariah, who had already stepped half a pace back, not retreating, not claiming space, simply existing in it with a quiet certainty that did not demand attention yet held it effortlessly. And there was a question forming in his mind, one that did not come from strategy or business, but from something more human, more immediate. And before he could overthink it, he asked, his tone steady but different now, "Where did you learn to do that?" And it was not a challenge, not an interrogation. It was genuine curiosity, the kind that does not assume it already knows the answer. And Zariah paused for a brief second, not because she needed time to respond, but because she recognized the shift in intention behind the question. And when she answered, her voice was calm, grounded. "My mother was deaf." And the simplicity of that sentence carried a depth that no elaborate explanation could match, because it was not about skill, it was about connection, about years of learning not from textbooks or training sessions, but from life, from necessity, from love. And as she spoke, there was no need to elaborate further, no need to prove anything. The truth of it was enough, and William absorbed it in silence, his expression softening in a way that few had ever seen. Because in that moment, the gap between them narrowed, not completely, not instantly, but enough to reveal something he had overlooked before: the difference between knowledge and understanding. And around them, the room continued to shift subtly, conversations quieter, glances more thoughtful, as if everyone present had been given a brief glimpse into something they had never taken the time to see. And Margaret watched the exchange with a quiet satisfaction, not because she needed validation, but because the moment itself had already done what it needed to do. It had been seen, acknowledged, understood, and that was enough. And as Zariah picked up her tray again, returning to her role without ceremony, without expectation, William did not immediately turn away, because something in him had changed direction, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably. And for a man who had always measured value in numbers, in deals, in outcomes, he was beginning to realize that some of the most important things in the room could not be measured at all, only recognized. And once seen, they could not be unseen. The night moved forward, but it no longer moved the same way, because once a room has been quietly challenged, it cannot fully return to what it was before. And William Carter felt that shift follow him even as he stepped away, even as conversations resumed around him, even as laughter tried to fill the spaces that had been opened, because something had settled deeper than sound, something that did not disappear with distraction. And he found himself watching more closely now, not just Zariah, but everyone. The way people spoke, the way they dismissed, the way they assumed, patterns he had once navigated without thinking now standing out with uncomfortable clarity. And across the room, Zariah continued her work as if nothing had happened, carrying glasses, adjusting place settings, moving with the same quiet rhythm. But she was no longer invisible, not to him, not to anyone who had been paying attention. And that was the difference, not in her, but in them. And as William observed, he began to notice something else: the way other staff members moved around her, some glancing at her with a new awareness, others unsure how to act, as if her presence had shifted the unspoken hierarchy they had all accepted without question. And it was in that subtle tension that William understood something he had missed his entire life: that recognition does not change the person being recognized, it changes the one doing the recognizing. And that realization stayed with him as he turned slightly and caught sight of Margaret again, now engaged in a quieter exchange with a guest who seemed to be trying, slowly, imperfectly, to communicate. And it was not smooth, not fluent, But it was effort, and effort, he realized, was where everything began. And for a man who had built his world on efficiency, on speed, on results, the idea of slowing down, of taking the time to understand something outside his own language, his own systems, felt almost foreign. And yet, for the first time, it did not feel like a weakness, it felt necessary. And he exhaled quietly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and made a decision, not one announced, not one performed for the room, but one that settled internally with a quiet certainty and without drawing attention. He approached one of the event coordinators, his voice low, controlled, but different now. Make sure we have someone on staff who can communicate like that at every event moving forward. And the request was simple, but its meaning was not, because it was not about convenience. It was about acknowledgement, about ensuring that what had just happened would not remain a rare exception. And as the coordinator nodded, slightly surprised but quick to respond, William stepped back again, his gaze returning briefly to Zariah, not with authority, not with expectation, but with something closer to respect. And though the night would continue, deals would still be discussed, names would still be exchanged, there was no denying that something fundamental had shifted, not in the room itself, but in the way it would be remembered, because long after the music faded and the lights dimmed, the most powerful moment of the evening would not be the one planned. It would be the one no one saw coming, the one that did not demand attention, but earned it, quietly, completely, and without asking for permission. By the time dessert was served, the room had found a new rhythm, quieter, more deliberate, as if everyone had unconsciously agreed to slow down just enough to notice what they had missed before. And Zariah continued moving through the tables with the same steady grace. But now there were subtle differences. Guests meeting her eyes instead of looking past her, small nods replacing silent expectations, and though nothing was announced, nothing was formally acknowledged, the shift was there, woven into the atmosphere like a new layer no one could ignore. And Margaret remained at her table, no longer isolated, her presence integrated into the flow of the evening, her conversations continuing through patient gestures and careful attention from those willing to try. And in that effort, imperfect but genuine, there was something quietly powerful, something that did not need perfection to matter. And William Carter observed it all from a distance at first, then closer, his posture no longer rigid with control but open with awareness, as if he was seeing not just the event, but the people within it for the first time without filters, without assumptions. And it was in that observation that another realization settled in, deeper than the first, because what had happened earlier was not just a moment of skill, not just an impressive display of communication. It was a mirror, reflecting back the gaps in a system he had always trusted, the blind spots in a world he had helped shape. And he understood now that recognition was not enough on its own, that seeing something once did not change what would happen tomorrow unless something followed it, something intentional. And that thought stayed with him as he approached Zariah again, not with urgency, not with authority, but with a kind of respect that had to be chosen. And when she turned to face him, her expression calm as ever, he spoke without hesitation this time, his voice steady, grounded. If you ever wanted something beyond this room, beyond this role, I would like to know. And the offer was not dressed in grandeur, not framed as a favor, but presented as an opening, a possibility. And Zariah listened, her eyes steady, not surprised, not eager, simply present. And for a brief moment, the noise of the room faded again, not completely, but enough to give space to what was being said. And she responded after a pause that carried thought, not doubt. I already have something beyond this room. And her words were not defensive, not dismissive. They were certain, grounded in a sense of self that did not depend on recognition or opportunity. And that answer, simple as it was, carried more weight than any acceptance could have, because it revealed something William had only just begun to understand. That value does not begin when it is noticed. It exists long before that. And he nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in acknowledgement, a recognition that what stood in front of him was not potential waiting to be discovered, but presence that had always been there. And as Zariah turned back to her work once more, the moment did not feel unfinished. It felt complete in a way that did not need resolution, because some moments do not exist to change someone's path. They exist to change someone's perspective. And as the evening continued, with its conversations and connections and carefully curated impressions, there was no denying that something more lasting had taken place, something that would not fade with the music or disappear with the lights, because once a person truly sees, even for a moment, they can never return to seeing the same way again. When the final glasses were cleared and the last notes of music faded into a quiet hum, the room began to empty, not with the urgency of obligation, but with the slow unwinding of an evening that had become something more than anyone had planned. And William Carter stood near the edge of it all, no longer at the center, no longer directing the flow, but observing the aftermath of a moment that had quietly rewritten the tone of the night. And as guests made their way out, offering polite farewells and measured smiles, there was something different in their eyes, a subtle awareness that lingered beneath the surface, as if each of them carried a piece of what they had witnessed, whether they fully understood it or not. And across the room, Margaret Hale prepared to leave, her movements calm, her presence steady, and Zariah was there again, not as a highlight, not as a spectacle, but as herself, assisting without drawing attention, her hands moving once more in a quiet exchange that needed no audience. And Margaret paused before stepping away, her gaze meeting Zariah's with a warmth that spoke of something deeper than gratitude, something closer to recognition. And though no words were spoken aloud, the meaning was clear, because some connections do not require sound to be understood. And William watched from a distance, not interrupting, not inserting himself into the moment, because he understood now that not every moment belonged to him. And that understanding, simple as it seemed, was something he had never truly allowed before. And as Margaret finally turned to leave, escorted with a respect that had been absent at the beginning of the night, the space she left behind did not feel empty, it felt changed, as if the room itself had been adjusted in a way that could not be reversed. And William exhaled slowly, a quiet acknowledgement of something settling within him, not a grand transformation, not a complete reinvention, but a shift, subtle and steady, like the first step in a direction he had never considered walking. And he glanced once more towards Zariah, who had already returned to her work, her presence blending back into the rhythm of the staff, but no longer unnoticed, not by him, not by anyone who had truly been paying attention. And for a moment, he considered saying more, doing more, but then he paused, recognizing that not every realization needs to be spoken to be real, and not every change needs to be announced to matter. And as he turned toward the exit, stepping out of the room that had once felt entirely his, he carried with him something far more valuable than any deal discussed that night. A quiet understanding that power may command attention, but it is understanding that earns it. And as the doors closed behind him, the echo of the evening remained, not in the walls, not in the fading music, but in the way he would see the next room he walked into. Because once someone truly learns to see, even for a single night, they can never again claim they did not know what they were missing.